I answered every question patiently, gave her the full tour, introduced her to Sam and to Yvonne, who had agreed, somewhat to my surprise and enormous gratitude, to serve as a character reference, and to my supervisor, Renata, who apparently gave a reference so glowing that Miss Devereux mentioned it twice in our follow-up meeting. The home study passed without complication. The adoption hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in the spring, almost exactly 2.5 years after the night I'd found her on my porch. I want to describe that morning carefully, because it is one of the handful of mornings in my life I would relive in full if I were ever given the chance to relive anything. Wren wore a small yellow dress that Yvonne had bought her for the occasion, with tights that she had, with the specific stubbornness of a 2.5-year-old, insisted on wearing backward, and which I had, after a brief negotiation, decided was a battle not worth fighting on a day that mattered far more than tights. Sam wore the closest thing he owned to a suit, which was not strictly speaking a suit, but a navy blazer he'd dug out for the occasion that I found unaccountably moving anyway. Yvonne came, and Renata and Pat, of course, looking as composed and quietly triumphant as I'd ever seen her. And no one else came. I want to record that plainly, without melodrama, because by that point it was simply a fact rather than a fresh wound. My parents had been notified, as a formality, and had not responded at all to that particular notification, not even with a returned unopened envelope. There was, by then, nothing left to send back. There was only the silence itself, which had become, over 2.5 years, almost its own kind of presence in the room, familiar in the way an old ache becomes familiar. Judge Okafor presided, by what felt at the time like a small mercy of scheduling, and recognized me, or recognized the file at least. The same petitioner from a guardianship hearing 2.5 years earlier, with a small, professional nod before the proceedings began. "Do you understand?" she asked me, in the particular ceremonial language that adoption hearings apparently require, "that by adopting this child, you are assuming all the rights and responsibilities of a parent, permanently and irrevocably, as though she had been born to you." "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "I understood that the night I found her. This is just the part where it becomes official. I had not planned to say that. It came out of me unrehearsed, and I remember the small, surprised warmth that crossed Judge Okafor's face before she resumed her formal cadence. And I remember Pat's hand finding mine under the table. And I remember, more than anything, the way Wren, too young to understand a single word of what was happening, dressed in a yellow dress, with her tights on backward, reached up at exactly that moment and patted my cheek with one small hand, the way she did when she wanted my attention for something far less significant than legal permanence, and said, with the perfect, oblivious timing of a toddler, "Mama, snack?" The whole courtroom laughed. Even Judge Okafor, briefly, before composing herself enough to finish the proceeding. The order was granted. Wren Calloway, the order read. I had, after considerable thought, decided to give her my own last name rather than keep any version of Celeste's. A decision I made with more grief than anger, because I did not want her carrying, every time she wrote, her own name for the rest of her life. A constant small reminder of the porch was now, fully and permanently, mine. Not my niece, not my ward, my daughter, in every sense that the law could make true. Backed now by a piece of paper that no email, no returned envelope, no future change of heart from anyone who had once called her a burden could ever undo. We got pancakes afterward, all of us, at a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse, and Wren ate most of mine in addition to her own. And Pat raised her water glass in a toast that made everyone at the table laugh and Yvonne cry a little. And I sat there in the spring light coming through a diner window, watching my daughter smear syrup across her chin with the single-minded joy of a 2.5-year-old who had just become, that morning, legally and finally, exactly who she had already been to me since the night I carried her in off a cold October porch. I started a new binder that weekend. The old one had grown too thick to manage as a single volume, and I split it, somewhat ceremonially, into 2, one for the past, everything up through the adoption, and one for whatever came next. I labeled the new binder's first tab not legal, this time, but simply Wren, because something in me had decided, that spring, that the next chapter of this record was no longer primarily about defending a position to a court. It was, for the first time in 2.5 years, simply about a life hers, and the one we were building together, one ordinary, undocumented in advance day at a time. I did not know yet how wrong I would eventually be about that distinction, nor how completely, years later, the two purposes of that binder, the personal and the legal, would collapse back into a single, inseparable thing. The years between the adoption and Ren's 7th birthday do not lend themselves easily to dramatic narration, and I want to honor that rather than dress them up as something they weren't. They were, for the most part, good years, the specific, unglamorous goodness of an ordinary childhood, which is its own kind of accomplishment when you consider the porch she'd started from. Even if it doesn't make for the most compelling chapter in a story someone might eventually tell about us, Sam moved in the year after the adoption. A decision that took us both longer than it probably should have, partly because I was cautious in a way that I think anyone who has built a life alone out of necessity becomes cautious, wary of letting anything in that might later have to be extracted at cost to a child who had already lost more family than any 3-year-old should have to absorb. But he was patient, the way he had always been patient. And Ren adored him with the particular, uncomplicated devotion of a small child for an adult who has never once made her feel like an inconvenience. And eventually the caution gave way to something simpler. He belonged with us. And pretending otherwise for the sake of some abstract principle of self-protection had stopped making sense. We did not marry. In those years, a fact that occasionally surprised people who assumed the shape of our household implied a wedding somewhere in its past. I won't pretend there's a tidy explanation for that beyond the plain truth that neither of us felt the absence of a ceremony as a lack, and that I had, by then, learned to be suspicious of any pressure, even gentle, well-meaning pressure to make my family look more conventional in order to be taken seriously as a family at all. We were a family. The paperwork that mattered to me was the kind sitting in a binder on a shelf in the hall closet, not the kind a wedding would have generated. Ren started preschool the fall after her 3rd birthday, at a small program 2 blocks from our house that Yvonne's younger daughter had also attended. And I remember standing at the drop-off line on her first day with an anxiety that felt, in its intensity, almost disproportionate to the actual occasion. 3 hours, twice a week, in a room full of finger paint and a teacher with 20 years of experience and an endless reserve of patience. But I had learned by then that my anxiety around Ren rarely calibrated itself to ordinary scale. Some of that was simply new parent worry, the universal kind. Some of it, I think, was the specific, harder-to-name fear of a woman who had built her daughter's entire stability out of her own unaided effort, and who had not yet fully unlearned the conviction that if she looked away for even 3 hours, something essential might slip. It didn't, of course. Ren thrived at preschool the way she thrived at most things. She had, even as a toddler, an open, curious confidence that I would like to take full credit for, and that I think, more honestly, simply belonged to her. Some inherited resilience from a gene pool I had decidedly mixed feelings about. Otherwise, she made friends easily. She came home with finger-painted artwork that I added, half joking and half serious, to a new school tab I created in what I had started calling, by then, with the particular dark humor of someone aware of her own habits, the Ren files. I sent the 9th and 10th emails to Celeste that year. On the same schedule, I'd settled into birthday, and one other occasion, usually a holiday or the start of a school year. Something that felt significant enough to warrant breaking the silence again, even though the silence never broke back. I included photographs in most of them by then. Ren's first day of preschool, a beach trip Sam and I had taken her on, a Halloween costume she'd insisted on designing herself, which had resulted in what could most charitably be described as an abstract dinosaur. I did not know, sending those photographs into the void year after year, whether Celeste ever opened a single one, whether the email address even still worked, whether she had built a life somewhere with no room left in it for the daughter she'd left on a porch, or whether, and this was the possibility that haunted me more than any other, though I rarely admitted it, even to Sam, she opened every single one and simply couldn't bring herself to respond. Trapped in some private architecture of guilt I would never be allowed to understand, I sent nothing to my parents that year beyond the standard birthday card, which came back unopened, as it always did, with the same flat, unbothered handwriting on the front. I had, by then, stopped expecting anything different, which I want to distinguish carefully from having stopped hoping. The hoping never fully went away, not even years in it, simply learned to live alongside the expectation of disappointment rather than in conflict with it. The way you can know, with total clinical certainty, that a particular treatment has a low success rate, and still feel something lift in your chest every single time you administer it anyway. The second real medical scare came when Ren was 4.5. An asthma diagnosis following a frightening night of labored breathing that sent us to the ER for the second time in her short life. Although this one resolved less dramatically than the febrile seizure had, no convulsion, just the slow, agonizing watching of a small chest working too hard to do something that should have been effortless. Until a nebulizer treatment finally eased it. I documented that one too. The same way I documented the seizure, time-stamped and detailed, and added a standing prescription, an inhaler, a written asthma action plan from her pediatrician to the incidents tab, which had, by Ren's 4th birthday, become one of the thicker sections in the binder. Not because she was an unusually sickly child, but because I had simply never stopped writing things down. Long after the original terror that had started, the habit had faded into something closer to muscle memory. Yvonne asked me once, around that time, watching me update the binder at her kitchen table after a particularly long shift, why I kept at it so faithfully when there was no one, as far as either of us could see, who was ever going to ask to see any of it. Habit, I told her, which was true, although not the whole truth. The fuller truth, which I think I understood even then, without quite having the words for it, was that the binder had become something closer to a love letter than a legal defense, a record, kept faithfully across years, no one else was watching, of exactly how much attention had gone into keeping one small, specific person alive and thriving. It did not need an audience to be worth doing. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me kept it precisely because no one else cared enough to keep it for her. If I didn't write down the date of her first lost tooth, the exact wording of the asthma action plan, the photographs from a Halloween where she insisted on being an abstract dinosaur, no one else in her bloodline beyond Sam and Yvonne and the family we'd assembled by choice instead of birth was ever going to bother. Someone had to be the keeper of all of it. It was simply going to be me. Ren started kindergarten the year she turned 5, at the public elementary school for blocks from our house, and came home the first week with a question that stopped me cold at the kitchen counter, mid-task. In a way few things had managed to since the porch itself. Where's my mom and dad? She asked, not with any particular distress, just the plain, unguarded curiosity of a 5-year-old who had noticed, in the way kindergartners notice everything sooner or later, that other kids' family structures sometimes came with different vocabulary than her own. Everyone has a mom and dad. I have. You and Sam. I had rehearsed some version of this conversation for years, in the abstract, the way you rehearse things you know are coming, but can't fully predict the shape of. What I told her that evening, sitting on the edge of her bed with the hallway light on, because she still didn't love full darkness, was the truth, calibrated to what a 5-year-old could actually metabolize, that I was her mom, now, fully and forever, the same way, it said on the papers from the judge, that she had been born to someone else first, a woman named Celeste, who hadn't been able to take care of her, and that not being able to take care of a baby didn't make Celeste a bad person, just someone who had made a hard choice, that I, personally, was still working out how to feel about, even all these years later, that it was okay to be curious about that, now or whenever the question came up again, and that I would always answer her honestly, whatever she asked, whenever she was ready to ask it. She absorbed this with the particular, uncomplicated equanimity that 5-year-olds sometimes manage better than adults ever do. Asked exactly one follow-up question: does she know I'm really good at swimming now? Which broke my heart and made me laugh in nearly the same breath. And then asked if she could have a glass of water and watch one more show before bed. The conversation apparently filed away, for the moment, in whatever drawer a 5-year-old's mind keeps things that matter enormously but don't yet require constant attention. I added a note to the binder that night, in a new section I'd started calling, with no particular plan for what it would eventually become, Conversations, not legal documentation in any formal sense, just a record for my own memory, and possibly for her someday, of exactly what we'd said to each other, and when, so that if she ever asked me, at 16 or 26, what I'd told her, and at what age, I would be able to give her the truth instead of whatever a decade of imperfect memory had reshaped it into. I did not know. Writing that note at the kitchen table with Sam already asleep down the hall, that within 2 years, The question of where's my mom and dad would acquire an entirely new and far more complicated answer. One that would arrive not through a schoolyard observation, but through a knock on the door from a man named Daniel Forsyth, who would tell me, with an unsteadiness in his voice that I came to believe, eventually, was genuine, that he had only just learned he had a daughter at all. I want to pause the forward momentum of this story for a moment to talk about the years themselves, not as a list of incidents, but as a texture, because I think it matters to understand what an ordinary, well-built life with Ren actually looked like before anyone else came to disturb it. And because I have noticed, in the retelling of family stories like ours, a tendency to skip straight from crisis to crisis, as though the years in between were simply waiting rooms. They were not waiting rooms. They were the actual substance of the thing. Ren, at 6, learned to ride a bike in the alley behind our house, with Sam running alongside her, holding the seat for exactly 4 attempts before she shook him off, declared she didn't need help anymore, and proceeded to wobble 40 feet down the asphalt with an expression of pure, unguarded triumph that I have never managed to adequately describe to anyone who wasn't there to see it. I have a photograph of that exact moment. Her arms not quite steady on the handlebars, her face split wide open with joy, that I keep, even now, in the front pocket of my wallet. Worn soft at the corners from years of being taken out and looked at, Ren at 7 decided, with the sudden, total conviction of a child who has just discovered a new passion, that she wanted to be a marine biologist, a goal she pursued with a seriousness that involved checking out every library book on the subject available within a 20-mile radius and asking me, more than once, whether I thought octopuses were smarter than dogs, a question I did not have a satisfying answer to, in which she eventually researched herself and reported back on with the confident authority of a much older child. I want to be honest, that not every day in those years was easy, because a story that pretends otherwise does Ren and Sam and myself all a disservice, flattening real people into something cleaner and less true than what we actually were. There were nights Ren cried, seemingly out of nowhere, in a way that I came to understand eventually, with the help of a child psychologist Yvonne recommended, as a kind of delayed grief, not for memories she consciously held, since she'd been an infant when Celeste left, but for an absence she could feel the shape of, even without being able to name it. The way you can feel a draft in a house without being able to locate the exact gap in the wall. It's coming through. We saw that psychologist, Dr. Whitfield, for about 1.5 years, starting when Ren was 7, in sessions that I attended for the first several months, and then, at Dr. Whitfield's careful, professional suggestion, mostly stepped back from, to give Ren room to process things without monitoring every word for my own reaction. I will admit that stepping back from those sessions was one of the harder disciplines of that whole period. The impulse to know everything, to document everything, to be present for every single thing that touched my daughter's inner life, ran so deep in me by then that learning to let her have a private room for her own grief, one I wasn't allowed to fully see into, felt almost like its own kind of loss. But I did it, because Dr. Whitfield was right, and because some part of the work of raising Ren well had always required learning the difference between the kind of documentation that protected her and the kind that would have, eventually, started to suffocate her. I kept a brief, factual note in the binder about the fact of the therapy itself, dates, provider, general purpose, and left the actual content of those hours where it belonged, between Ren and Dr. Whitfield. And later, increasingly, simply inside Ren herself, processed and metabolized and folded into the ordinary, resilient person she was becoming. My relationship with my parents in those years settled into something I can only describe as a kind of cold, permanent weather system, not actively hostile, since there was no contact left through which hostility could be actively expressed, but a steady, low pressure that I learned to live under the way you learn to live under any climate. You can't change, dressing for it, planning around it, occasionally forgetting for whole stretches of ordinary life that it was even there. I sent the cards. I sent the emails to Celeste, fewer now, perhaps 3 or 4 a year, by Ren's 7th birthday, but never fully stopping, because some stubborn part of me had decided, somewhere around year 3, that stopping would mean accepting a version of the story I still wasn't willing to accept, the version where the door simply closed, permanently, instead of remaining open, however, pointlessly. On the chance that someone might someday walk through it. I did hear, once indirectly, about Celeste in Ren's 6th year, a mutual friend from our hometown, someone neither of us had spoken to in years, reached out to me on social media with the kind of careful, slightly nosy concern that people who haven't earned the right to ask still sometimes feel entitled to, mentioning that she'd run into Celeste at a wedding, and that Celeste had seemed good actually, like she's really turned things around. I did not respond to that message beyond a polite, non-committal thanks for letting me know, and I added it to the binder anyway, because by then documenting had become so thoroughly woven into how I processed information about my own life that I genuinely couldn't have stopped doing it even if I'd wanted to. There was a particular Tuesday in Ren's 5th year that I have never written down anywhere before this account because it felt, for a long time, too small to matter and too tender to risk flattening with words. She had a school project that fall, a family tree, the kind every elementary school in the country apparently assigns at some point. Construction paper and glue and a worksheet with branches waiting to be filled in with names. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with her, the same table that held the binder, watching her stare at the worksheet with a small, furrowed concentration, and asking me, with no particular distress, simply curiosity, what she should write in the boxes for grandparents. I told her honestly that she had biological grandparents who lived far away and weren't part of our regular life, and that she was welcome to leave those boxes blank, or to fill them in with people who acted like grandparents even if they weren't. By blood, Yvonne's own mother, for instance, who had taken to calling Ren my extra granddaughter without any prompting from either of us, and who showed up for every school event with the same steady enthusiasm she brought to her own grandchildren's. Ren considered this for a long moment, the particular gravity of a 5-year-old weighing a decision that felt, to her, enormous. Then she carefully wrote Yvonne's mother's name in both boxes, drew a small, lopsided heart beside each one, and asked if that was allowed. That's allowed, I told her, and meant it more completely than almost anything else I said to her that entire year. Family is the people who show up, Ren. That's the only rule that's ever mattered. I kept that worksheet. It lives in the school tab, behind a folder of report cards and art projects, slightly creased from the years it spent folded in my own desk drawer before I finally found a permanent place for it. And I have taken it out to look at it more times than I can count, particularly in the years since, when the question of who counted as family stopped being something a 5-year-old could settle with glue and construction paper and became, instead, the subject of sworn testimony in a courtroom. There were harder days, too, scattered among the good ones, the way there always are in any honest accounting of a childhood. Ren went through a stretch, around age 6, of asking the same handful of questions on a loop, usually at bedtime, usually just as I thought a conversation was winding down rather than beginning. Why didn't Celeste want her? Was it something she'd done? Would I ever leave the way Celeste had? I answered each iteration of those questions with the same patient honesty I brought to the first time she'd asked, resisting the urge strong, some nights, after a 12-hour shift, when patience felt like the scarcest resource I owned, to simply repeat my previous answer rather than actually sit with the question again, fresh, the way she needed me to. I am not going anywhere, I told her, more times than I could count across those years, in more or less the same words each time, because I came to understand that the repetition itself was part of what she needed, not a new answer, but the same steady one, proving its steadiness precisely by never changing. What happened with Celeste was about her, not about anything wrong with you. You didn't do anything. You were a baby. Babies can't do anything wrong. I want to mark, too, a smaller, quieter thing that mattered enormously in those years. I became, gradually, without quite planning it, someone other people in similar situations sought out for advice. Word travels in the particular ecosystem of nurses and social workers and family law offices about who has actually survived the kind of thing you're currently drowning in. And I began fielding occasional calls from a co-worker's cousin who'd unexpectedly become a kinship guardian for a grandnephew, from a stranger Pat referred to me directly, a young woman who had found herself, almost identically to how I had, suddenly responsible for a relative's infant overnight. I told all of them roughly the same things Yvonne had once told me. Get a lawyer immediately, even if it feels like overkill. Document everything. Starting now, even the things that feel too small or too painful to write down. Keep every attempt at contact, even the ones that get ignored, especially the ones that get ignored. I did not yet fully understand, giving that advice to strangers across those years, how directly I would eventually need to follow it myself in a courtroom. Against the very family the advice had originally been built to survive in the first place, Sam asked me once. On an ordinary Sunday morning, when Ren was 7.5, lying in the unhurried quiet of a weekend with no shift and no school, whether I thought we'd ever hear from Celeste or my parents again. I used to think the silence would have a reason eventually, I told him, like there was some explanation coming someday that would make sense of all of it. I've mostly stopped expecting that. I think some people just decide a thing is too costly to deal with, and they keep deciding that, year after year, until deciding it becomes its own kind of permanent choice. Even if they never frame it to themselves that way, do you think they'd come back? Sam asked, if something changed? If there were some reason it suddenly seemed worth the cost? I remember laughing at the question, not because it was funny, but because it struck me, in that exact moment, as so abstractly hypothetical that it barely seemed worth seriously entertaining. I don't know what that reason would even look like, I said. Guilt, maybe eventually, if Celeste ever has more kids and looks at them and thinks about Ren. I genuinely can't imagine what would bring my parents back. I've stopped trying to imagine it. It's not productive. I did not know. Lying in bed on that ordinary Sunday morning, with my daughter asleep down the hall, and a man beside me who had built an entire steady life around the two of us without ever once being asked to. That the reason Sam's question anticipated was already, at that very moment, taking its first tentative shape 3 states away, in the careful, methodical curiosity of a man who had recently discovered, through a piece of information he hadn't been looking for, that a woman he'd dated briefly nearly 8 years earlier had given birth to a daughter he had never been told existed. I would meet that man, Daniel Forsyth, for the first time less than 6 months later. And though I did not understand it yet, sitting in that quiet Sunday bedroom, with no reason to suspect anything was about to change, his arrival would set in motion, with a slow, patient inevitability I could not have predicted, every single thing that came after the trust, the affidavit. The reappearance of the very family whose silence I had just described to Sam as a permanent, unchangeable weather system. Weather, it turns out, changes. Sometimes the only thing required is a reason large enough to be worth braving it. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in March. The same week, Ren lost her second front tooth and insisted on a celebratory dinner at the pizza place with the arcade games. A detail I remember with peculiar clarity precisely because it sat in such strange contrast to what the letter contained. The ordinary triumph of a 7-year-old's smile newly gapped against the formal, careful handwriting of a stranger, informing me that he believed he might be her father. I almost threw it away unopened, I'll admit, mistaking it at first glance for the kind of solicitation that arrives regularly enough at any address with a child's name attached to public records somewhere, school fundraisers, insurance offers, the occasional unsettling marketing letter addressed directly to a minor. It was the return address that stopped me, a name I didn't recognize. Daniel Forsyth, from a city 3 states away. With nothing else on the envelope to explain why a stranger from somewhere I'd never lived would be writing to me at all, I opened it, standing at the kitchen counter. The same counter where I'd once made a list on the back of an envelope nearly 8 years earlier. And I remember the specific, vertiginous feeling of the floor seeming to tilt slightly beneath me as I read it, the words rearranging the entire architecture of a story I had believed. By then, I understood completely, he wrote, in careful, deliberate sentences that read like someone who had drafted and redrafted the letter many times before sending it, that he had dated a woman named Celeste Calloway briefly, nearly 8 years earlier, in the city where they'd both lived at the time, before their relationship ended and they lost touch. He wrote that he had recently, through a circumstance he didn't fully explain in that first letter, though he would later, in person, come across information suggesting Celeste had given birth to a daughter approximately 9 months after their relationship ended. A daughter who was, according to the same information, currently being raised by Celeste's sister. He wrote that he understood how this letter might land, that he had no wish to disrupt a stable family or insert himself into a child's life in any way that wasn't wanted, that he simply needed to know, for his own peace of mind, and because he believed he had a right to know. Whether the timeline matched and whether there was any possibility the child was his, he included a phone number. He did not include any demands, any legal threats, any indication that he intended this to be anything other than exactly what it claimed to be: a man trying to find out the truth about something that had apparently been kept from him for the better part of a decade. I called Pat before I called him, which I think tells you something true about who I had become by that point in my life, and something true too about how thoroughly the instinct to protect Ren's stability had overtaken every other instinct I had. "Don't respond yet," Pat said, after I'd read her the letter over the phone. Her voice, carrying the particular alertness I'd come to recognize as her assessing a new variable in a case she'd thought, until that exact moment, was largely settled. "Not because I think this is a scam. It doesn't read like one, and there are easier scams than tracking down a specific child's adoptive guardian with this much careful detail. But we need to think through what this means before you say a single word to him. Because if he is who he says he is, this changes some things. And I want you walking into that conversation understanding exactly what those things are, what it meant." As Pat carefully laid out over the following days, was both simpler and more complicated than my first instinct suggested. The adoption I'd finalized when Ren was 2.5 had terminated Celeste's parental rights. It had not, and could not have, addressed the rights of a father who had never been named, located, or given notice, because, as far as the court record showed at the time, no father had ever been identified. If Daniel Forsyth was, in fact, Ren's biological father, and if he had genuinely never known of her existence until recently, he might, Pat was careful with this word, might, turning it over with the precision of someone who didn't want to alarm me, before the facts were established, have grounds to challenge the validity of an adoption that had proceeded, without any attempt to locate or notify him. I did not sleep well for the better part of a week after that conversation. I want to be honest about the shape of my fear in that period, because I think it explains everything that came afterward more clearly than any amount of retrospective composure would. I was afraid, plainly and primally, of losing her, not to Celeste. I had made my peace, however hard won, with the fact that Celeste was gone, in whatever sense gone meant for her. But the idea of a stranger, a man I had never met, holding some legal claim that could unravel 8 years of legally secured motherhood, struck a fear in me unlike anything I'd felt since the porch itself. I called Daniel Forsyth on the following Monday, after Pat and I had discussed exactly how to approach the conversation, carefully, factually, without volunteering more than necessary until we understood his actual intentions. He answered on the second ring, and I remember being struck immediately by how nervous he sounded, not aggressive, not entitled, simply nervous, in the specific way of someone who has rehearsed a conversation many times and still finds the reality of having it harder than the rehearsal. "Thank you for calling," he said, before I'd said more than my name. "I wasn't sure you would. I'm calling because I need to understand what you're actually asking for," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. "Your letter was careful about a lot of things. It wasn't careful about that." He was quiet for a moment. "I found out about her 3 weeks ago," he said. "I want to be honest with you about how, because I think it matters. Celeste's mother, not your mother, her father's side. I should be specific. She and my mother ended up at the same retirement community a few years back, completely by coincidence, and they got friendly, the way people do in those places. And at some point recently, in some conversation I wasn't part of, it came up that Celeste had a daughter, that the daughter was being raised by Celeste's sister. My mother put the dates together when Celeste and I were together, when the timeline would have worked, and she came to me with it because she thought I deserved to know. And I have not been able to think about much else since." "You didn't know," I said. "It wasn't entirely a question. I did not know," he said. And something in the specific, unguarded rawness of his voice in that moment is part of why, despite every reason for suspicion that Pat and I had carefully laid out over the preceding week, I found myself believing him almost immediately. I want to be clear that I'm not accusing Celeste of anything. I can prove I don't know what she was thinking, or why she never told me. And frankly, I haven't spoken to her in 8 years, and I'm not sure I want that conversation to be the first thing I do about any of this. I called you instead. I want a DNA test if you're willing. I want to know for certain, before anything else happens. And I want to say clearly, right now, before that test even happens, whatever the answer is, I am not trying to take a child away from a stable home. That is not why I wrote to you. I don't even fully know yet what I am trying to do. I just couldn't, in good conscience, find out I might have a daughter and do nothing. I told him I needed to think about it, which was true, and that I would call him back within the week, which I did. After Pat and I had spent several more days working through every contingency we could anticipate, what a positive result would mean legally. What protections existed for Ren's stability regardless of biology. What Pat called, with her usual blunt clarity, the difference between a man who wants to know the truth and a man who wants to use the truth as leverage, which are not always distinguishable from the first phone call, but which usually become distinguishable fast. If you watch carefully, I watched carefully. I want that on the record too, because so much of what followed the trust, the affidavit, the unlikely, hard-won trust that eventually grew between Daniel Forsyth and myself, depended on a vigilance I never fully relaxed, not even years later. Not even after everything he eventually did to protect Ren had made his good faith about as clear as good faith can ever be made, but I agreed to the test. And 6 weeks later, sitting across a small conference table from Pat with a lab report between us, I learned that the man who had written me a careful, nervous letter in March was, beyond any statistical doubt, the lab's methodology allowed for, Ren's biological father. I called Daniel that same afternoon, before I'd even fully absorbed the number on the page myself, because some instinct in me, the same instinct, I think, that had once made me pick up a baby off a porch, instead of calling someone else to handle it first, told me that this particular truth, however complicated it was about to make my life, deserved to be delivered directly, rather than through a lawyer's letter. It's a match, I told him, and I heard him exhale, long and unsteady. On the other end of the line, the sound of a man who had spent 6 weeks not allowing himself to fully believe something he had, nonetheless, clearly already started to hope for. What happens now? He asked, and I remember thinking, in that moment, that it was the most honest question anyone could have asked, because I did not have a clean answer for him. I did not have a clean answer for myself either. I only knew that whatever came next would require more careful navigating than anything I had managed since the guardianship hearing itself, and that the 7-year-old asleep down the hall, blissfully unaware that her entire understanding of her own family was about to expand in a direction none of us could yet fully predict, deserved every bit of that careful navigation I had left in me. What happens now? It turned out, was a slow and deliberately, unhurried process that Pat and I designed with the same care we'd once put into the guardianship petition, not because Daniel had given us any specific reason to distrust him in the weeks following the DNA results, but because 8 years of building Ren's stability, brick by careful brick, had taught me, thoroughly, that the things worth protecting are exactly the things you protect most carefully, when everyone involved seems to be acting in good faith. Since good faith is precisely the condition under which people let their guard down too soon, we're not going to just put a 7-year-old in a room with a man she's never met and call it a reunion, Pat said, in one of our planning sessions that spring. And I remember the specific relief I felt at hearing someone else articulate with full professional authority exactly the instinct I'd been carrying myself, but hadn't yet found the confidence to insist on. We do this in stages. Letters first. Maybe, if he's willing, something low stakes that lets her get used to the idea of him existing before she has to manage the actual experience of meeting him. Then a supervised visit, short, neutral location, you present the whole time. We build from there based on how it goes, not based on how eager he is to skip ahead. Daniel agreed to every stage of that plan without resistance, which I noted carefully as one more data point in the slowly accumulating case for his trustworthiness. He wrote Ren a letter first, one I read in full before deciding whether to share it with her, a precaution Daniel himself had anticipated and explicitly invited, telling me on the phone that he understood completely if I needed to vet everything he sent for as long as I needed to. The letter was simple, warm without being presumptuous, careful not to claim any title he hadn't yet earned. He told her, in language pitched carefully toward a 7-year-old's understanding, that he was someone who had just found out he was her biological father, that he didn't expect anything from her, that he would love to meet her someday if she ever wanted to, and that in the meantime he just wanted her to know he existed, and that he was glad, more glad than he could easily explain in a letter, that she had grown up safe and loved. I sat with Ren on her bed that evening and explained, in the same careful, age-appropriate way I'd explained Celeste 2 years earlier, that there was a man who had just found out he was her biological dad, using the language Dr. Whitfield had helped me develop for exactly this kind of layered family conversation, and that he'd sent her a letter if she wanted to see it. She was quiet for a long moment, turning the idea over with the particular seriousness she brought to anything that mattered to her. And then she asked, "Does he know I'm good at swimming now?" It was almost word for word the same question she'd asked about Celeste 2 years earlier, and I had to take a moment, sitting on the edge of her bed, before I could answer her, because something about the repetition of that exact small, hopeful question, "Does this stranger know the specific things that make me who I am?" undid me more than almost anything else in the entire unfolding situation had managed to. "Not yet," I told her. "But you could tell him if you wanted to write back." She did want to. She dictated a response to me that I helped her write down. A few sentences about swimming and a dog she wanted but didn't have yet, and a question about whether he liked pizza, which I sent to Daniel exactly as she'd composed it, unedited, because it felt important that whatever relationship formed between them begin with her actual voice rather than any adult's careful curation of it. The supervised visit happened a month later, on neutral ground, a children's museum in a city roughly halfway between where Daniel lived and where we did, chosen specifically because it offered enough structured activity that an awkward first meeting between a man and his biological daughter wouldn't have to sustain itself on conversation alone. I watched Daniel from across a hands-on water exhibit, where Ren had immediately, predictably gravitated, and I remember the specific care with which he approached her, crouching to her eye level without being asked, asking her questions about how the water exhibit worked instead of asking her questions about herself, letting her lead the entire interaction at the pace she set, rather than the pace his own nervousness might have preferred. "You're really good at this," she told him. About 40 minutes in, observing some small mechanism in the water exhibit he'd helped her figure out, and I watched his face do something complicated and unguarded in response to a sentence that most adults would have barely registered as praise at all. "I work with my hands a lot," he told her. "I build things for a living. I bet you'd be good at it too, if you wanted to learn." "I'm going to be a marine biologist," she informed him, with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old who had already decided this fact about her own future and saw no reason for anyone to doubt it. "Then you should definitely learn how things work," he said, with a seriousness that matched hers exactly, neither performing enthusiasm nor talking down to her. And I remember thinking, watching that exchange from a respectful distance, that whatever else turned out to be true about Daniel Forsyth, he seemed to genuinely see her not as an idea he'd recently discovered, not as a wrong he needed to correct, but as an actual 7-year-old person with actual 7-year-old opinions worth taking seriously. I want to be honest, that the visit also stirred up complicated feelings in me that had nothing to do with Daniel's behavior, and everything to do with my own long-buried fears. Watching Ren laugh easily with a near stranger, watching her show him the same unguarded delight she showed me on her best days, I felt a flicker of something I am not proud of, not quite jealousy, but adjacent to it. A kind of primal alarm that had spent 8 years associating any new adult entering Ren's orbit with potential loss. I had built her entire stability myself, alone, brick by exhausting brick, and some old, unhealed part of me flinched at the sight of someone else slotting into her life with what looked, from across a museum floor, like effortless ease. I talked about that feeling with Sam that night, after Ren had fallen asleep, recounting the entire visit in exhausting, joyful detail, and he listened the way he always listened, without rushing to reassure me out of a feeling before I'd finished actually having it. "You're allowed to feel that," he said, finally. "It doesn't make you small, wanting to be the most important person in her life. You've earned that position about as thoroughly as any parent ever earns anything. But I don't think Daniel showing up costs you that position. I think it just means she gets more people who love her. And you've never once, in the entire time I've known you, treated more love in her life as a threat to your own. Don't start now. Just because this version of more love came with a complicated entrance, he was right, although it took me longer than I'd like to admit to fully metabolize that he was right. The visits continued over the following months, monthly, then more frequent, as both Ren and I grew more comfortable. Daniel always careful, always patient, never once pushing for more access than what had been offered, never once treating my caution as an obstacle rather than a reasonable, earned position. I documented every visit in the binder, the way I documented everything. Though this section grew its own character, distinct from medical or legal, a tab I eventually labeled Daniel, dates and notes on each visit, Ren's reactions afterward, the gradual, visible deepening of whatever this new relationship was becoming. I did not know, building that record month by month, how directly it would eventually matter, nor in what context. I simply documented because documenting was, by then, simply who I had become. A woman who wrote things down because writing them down was how she made sure nothing essential about her daughter's life was ever left only to memory. By the time Ren turned 8, Daniel had become a regular, welcome presence, not a father in the daily, structural sense that I was, but something real and valuable nonetheless. A man who called every other week, who flew in for her school plays when his schedule allowed, who had, with what struck me increasingly as genuine and uncomplicated love, simply decided to show up for the daughter he'd only just learned existed, with none of the resentment or performance I had half expected. All those months earlier, when his letter first landed on my kitchen counter, I want to describe one particular visit from that year, because it captures something about Daniel that the more formal account of trusts and affidavits, however important to the eventual legal outcome, doesn't fully convey on its own. He had flown in for a weekend, no special occasion, simply because his schedule allowed it, and he'd told me, on the phone beforehand, that he missed her in a way he hadn't fully expected to. Given how recently and how strangely she'd come into his life, he arrived on a Saturday morning with a small, battered toolbox, the kind a person actually uses rather than displays, and asked Ren, with no preamble beyond the question itself, whether she wanted to learn how to build something. She did, immediately and enthusiastically. And the two of them spent the better part of that afternoon in the backyard constructing what was nominally meant to be a simple birdhouse and became, through Ren's increasingly elaborate input, something closer to a multi-room avian apartment complex, complete with what she insisted on calling a lookout tower that Daniel patiently helped her engineer despite its dubious structural value. I watched them from the kitchen window for most of that afternoon, doing the dishes slowly, in no hurry to finish, simply because the sight of my daughter handing a strange, careful man a screwdriver with the easy trust of someone who had decided, on her own terms and at her own pace, that he belonged in her life, was the kind of thing I wanted to hold on to for as long as the dishes would let me. You're patient with her, I told Daniel that evening, once Ren had gone to bed, exhausted and thoroughly pleased with herself. The lopsided birdhouse already installed in our one decent tree. She's easy to be patient with, he said. She listens. She asks good questions. I spent 36 years not knowing what that felt like, having a kid who actually wants to know what you think about things. I'm not going to waste a single afternoon of it being impatient. I documented that birdhouse weekend in the Daniel tab, the way I documented everything, dates and a brief description. And I want to be honest, that's something about writing down birdhouse, multi-room, with lookout tower in the same, careful, factual hand I'd used for medical incidents and legal filings struck me, even at the time, as faintly absurd proof. If I'd needed any further proof that the binder had stopped being purely a legal defense years before, I'd have admitted as much out loud, and had become, instead, simply the record of an entire life, the silly parts included. I did not yet know that this slow, careful, hard-won trust between us was about to take a turn neither of us could have anticipated, one that would require Daniel to make a decision, on Ren's behalf, more consequential than any of the museum visits or birthday calls that had built the foundation for it. That decision, when it came, would change the entire shape of what happened years later in ways that none of us, sitting in that children's museum watching water move through plastic tubes, could possibly have foreseen. Daniel asked to meet with me alone, without Ren, on a Saturday afternoon, about a year after our first phone call, at a coffee shop near my house, rather than the museum or any of the other neutral, child-centered locations we'd grown accustomed to. I remember feeling a small jolt of the old wariness at the request alone meetings. In my experience by then, tended to precede some kind of shift, and shifts, in the long history of this particular family, had rarely arrived bearing good news. This one did. Although it took a winding road to get there. I want to tell you some things about my own family, Daniel said. Once we'd settled into a corner table with coffee, neither of us drank much of, because I think it explains some of what I'm about to ask you. And I'd rather you understand the reasoning than just the request, he told me, in the careful, deliberate way I'd come to recognize as his default register for anything that mattered. About his own father, who had died when Daniel was 12. Leaving behind almost nothing in the way of financial or legal preparation. No will, no clear plan, a small, contested estate that had taken his mother years and most of what little money there was to entangle through court. He told me he had grown up watching that mess play out, watching his mother, exhausted by paperwork and lawyers' fees at exactly the time she should have been allowed to simply grieve, and that he had promised himself, even as a child, that he would never leave behind that kind of unfinished business for anyone he loved. I've been thinking about Ren a lot, he said. Not just about visits, about her actual future. What happens to her if something happens to me? What happens to her, period, given everything I now understand about her situation? He paused, the careful diplomatic pause of someone choosing his next words with real deliberation. I know about your parents. I know about Celeste. You haven't hidden any of it from me. And I respect that more than I think I've said out loud. I want to set something up for her, a trust, something that's hers specifically, protected, that nobody can touch or contest or redirect. Regardless of what happens with me or with anyone else in this picture, I sat with that for a moment, turning it over with the same careful suspicion I'd learned to bring to anything that sounded, on its surface, too straightforwardly generous. Why now? I asked, not unkindly, but directly. Because directness had served me well in every important conversation of the past 8 years, and I saw no reason to abandon it for this one. You've known about her for a year. Why is this the moment? Because I had a health scare, he said, and something in his voice shifted, became less rehearsed, more plainly nervous. Nothing dramatic. They caught it early. It's being treated. I'm not telling you this to be dramatic about it. But it made me think, in a way I hadn't quite let myself think before, about what happens to the things I care about if I'm not around to manage them myself. And I realized, sitting in that doctor's office, that I had a daughter out there who has exactly the kind of family history where things can go wrong in ways that take years to untangle. The way my mother's situation took years to untangle. And I didn't want to be one more person who left her with a mess instead of a foundation. I want to be honest that I cried a little at that. In a coffee shop on a Saturday afternoon, in a way that surprised both of us. Not because the diagnosis frightened me on his behalf exactly, though it did by then. I had come to genuinely care about Daniel Forsyth in the specific, hard-won way you come to care about someone who has proven, repeatedly and without performance, that they actually mean the things they say. I cried because the sentiment itself, a foundation instead of a mess, landed somewhere very close to the exact thing I had spent 8 years trying to build for Ren myself. Alone, with a Navy 3-ring binder and a stubborn refusal to let anyone call her a burden. And hearing someone else articulate that same instinct, unprompted, from an entirely separate direction, felt like an unexpected kind of vindication. I want you as the sole trustee, he continued. Once I'd composed myself enough to keep listening. Not a bank. Not some attorney who's never met her. You, because you're the one who's actually shown up for her, every single day, for 8 years. And I trust you with this completely. I'll have my own attorney draw up the structure. Distributions for education, healthcare, a reasonable allowance as she gets older. The principal protected and growing until she's an adult. With you having discretion over anything that comes up in between. I want it ironclad. I want it the kind of structure that nobody can contest or manipulate ever, regardless of what happens to me or what anyone else in this story decides to want once they find out it exists. You think someone will try, I said. It wasn't really a question. Daniel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the same care he'd brought to everything else that afternoon. I don't know your parents. I don't know Celeste, not really, not anymore. 8 years and a handful of months together a decade ago doesn't make me an expert on who she's become. But I know money changes things in families that have already shown they don't operate from a place of unconditional love. I'd rather build something defensible from the start than build something simple and have to fight to defend it later. After the fact, after it's already been weakened by whatever challenge comes, he was right, in a way that I would only fully appreciate years later, sitting across a different table from a different set of careful, deliberate professionals, watching the very structure he'd insisted on that Saturday afternoon hold up, exactly as designed, against precisely the challenge he'd anticipated before either of us had any concrete reason to expect it. There was one more thing Daniel wanted that day, a request that struck me, when he first raised it, as oddly specific, given how carefully measured everything else about his approach had been. "I want to sign an affidavit," he said. "A sworn, notarized statement, laying out what I know and believe to be true about Celeste's abandonment of Ren, the timeline. What I understand from your account and from the court record of the termination proceedings. My own assessment of the situation as someone who's now spent a year getting to know both you and Ren and forming my own judgment about who actually showed up and who didn't. I want it on record, separately from your own documentation, from an independent third party who has no reason to lie and every reason, given that I'm her biological father, to be taken seriously. If anyone ever questions it, you think it'll be questioned," I said again. "The same observation in a slightly different shape, I think," Daniel said, with the particular careful honesty that had, by then, become the foundation of whatever trust existed between us, that I'd rather have built too much protection around her and never need most of it, than build too little and discover the gap exactly when it matters most. You've spent 8 years building a record. Nobody asked you to build, because you understood, on some level, that the record might matter someday, even though you couldn't say exactly when or how. I'd like to add my own piece to that record, for the same reason, even if neither of us ever needs it." He was, of course, more right than either of us could have known that Saturday afternoon. The affidavit he signed 3 weeks later, in front of a notary in his attorney's office, with language so carefully precise that Pat, when I eventually showed it to her, made a small, approving sound I'd rarely heard from her before. That affidavit would sit quietly in a file for years, unremarked upon, unnecessary. Simply one more document in a steadily growing record of a family that had shown up for Ren from every direction except the one that shared her blood by birth. It would not stay unnecessary forever. But that Saturday, walking out of the coffee shop into ordinary afternoon light, all I felt was the specific, grateful relief of having found, against every reasonable expectation, given how this story had started, one more person willing to build something permanent and protective around my daughter. Asking nothing in return except the chance to know her, I called Pat that evening to tell her what Daniel was proposing. And I remember her long pause on the other end of the line before she finally spoke. "In 12 years of doing this work," she said, "I have had exactly one other case where a biological parent showed up wanting to add protection instead of leverage. I want you to understand how rare that is, and how much it tells you about who he actually is. Take the trust, take the affidavit, and Marin, keep documenting every single thing about how this unfolds, exactly the way you always have, because if I'm right about why he's being this careful, you're going to need every page of it eventually, even if eventually turns out to be years away." It turned out to be almost exactly 6 years away, but I am getting ahead of the story again. A habit I clearly never fully managed to train out of myself, even all these years later. Telling it now, with the full knowledge of everything that came after, the trust was finalized that autumn, in a process that involved more paperwork than even I, with 8 years of binder keeping behind me, was fully prepared for. Daniel's attorney, a meticulous estate planning specialist named Mr. Okonkwo Lewis, whom Pat clearly respected on site, structured it exactly the way Daniel had described in the coffee shop, an irrevocable trust, funded initially with a sum that startled me when I first heard the figure, with provisions for education, healthcare, and a measured, age-gated distribution schedule that would give Ren access to the principal in stages once she reached adulthood, rather than handing an 18-year-old the kind of money that could, mismanaged, do as much harm as good. I was named sole trustee, exactly as Daniel had insisted, with full discretion over distributions in the years before Ren came of age, bound by fiduciary obligations that Mr. Okonkwo Lewis walked me through with a patience I came to genuinely appreciate. Given how unfamiliar the entire vocabulary of trust and fiduciary duty was to a woman whose financial education, up to that point, had consisted mostly of stretching a nurse's salary across a child's unpredictable needs, you understand. He told me, in our final meeting before the documents were signed, that this binds you legally, not just morally. You'll need to keep records of every distribution, every decision, available for review if it's ever questioned. This isn't a gift you simply receive on her behalf. It's a responsibility with real legal teeth. I've been keeping records on her behalf for 8 years. I told him, and I remember the small, surprised smile that crossed his face at that. The particular satisfaction of a careful professional realizing he was handing a serious responsibility to someone who would actually treat it with the seriousness it deserved. I added a new tab to the binder that week. Trust, sitting alphabetically and thematically somewhere between medical and Daniel. Although by then the binder itself had grown into something closer to a small filing cabinet's worth of material, organized across 3 separate volumes that lived together on a dedicated shelf I'd installed in the hall closet specifically because the original arrangement had long since become unmanageable. Ren, for her part, understood almost nothing of the financial architecture being built around her that autumn, which was exactly as it should have been at 8 years old. What she understood was that Daniel, whom she now called, with a casual ease that still occasionally caught in my chest, just Daniel, never Dad, a distinction both of them had arrived at organically, and that I had never once pushed in either direction, had become a steady, reliable presence in her life, someone who called every other Sunday, who sent her books about marine biology that he'd clearly researched specifically for her interests rather than grabbed off a generic gift list, who flew in for her 3rd grade science fair and stood at the back of the gymnasium beaming with a pride so unguarded that I had to look away from him at one point. Overcome by an emotion I hadn't expected a science fair to provoke in me. I want to dwell on that science fair for a moment, because it represents, in miniature, exactly the kind of good year that followed the trust's finalization. Ordinary, textured, full of the specific small triumphs that make up an actual childhood, rather than a story's dramatic turning points. Ren's project that year involved a homemade model of ocean current circulation, built with food coloring and warm and cold water in a clear plastic tub. A project she had insisted on designing herself, after rejecting 3 of my more conventional suggestions as boring with the particular confidence of a 3rd grader who had, by then, fully absorbed the idea that her opinions about marine science were worth taking seriously. She won 2nd place in her grade, an outcome she accepted with gracious disappointment and a clearly stated intention to do something even better next year. And Daniel, watching from the back of the gymnasium, told me afterward in the parking lot that he had never in his life felt prouder of something he'd had so little to do with. You had everything to do with this. I told him, and I meant it, because by then I had stopped experiencing his presence in her life as any kind of competition with my own. Sam's advice from the year before had settled fully into truth for me by that point. More love had not diluted what Ren and I had built together. It had simply expanded the circle of people who showed up for her. And there's no version of that expansion that I would trade back. Not even knowing everything that came after. My parents made no appearances in any of this, that year or any year. I sent the standard birthday card. It came back unopened, as it always did. I did not send Daniel's existence as news to them. There seemed no point, no audience on the other end who had earned the right to that information. And some protective instinct in me, by then well honed, preferred to keep the genuinely good things in Ren's life as far from their orbit as possible, on the theory that good things, once known about, sometimes attract exactly the kind of attention you'd rather avoid. I would, in hindsight, come to see that instinct as more prescient than I had any right to expect it to be at the time. Celeste, similarly, remained entirely absent. No response to any of the now roughly 24 emails I'd sent her over the years. No acknowledgement, as far as I was ever able to determine, that she was even aware Daniel had re-entered the picture at all. I assumed, without any particular evidence either way, that she simply didn't know that whatever channel had carried information about Ren's existence to Daniel's mother, through the coincidence of a shared retirement community, had not carried equivalent information back in the other direction, toward Celeste herself. I was wrong about that, as it eventually turned out. Although it would be years before I understood exactly how wrong. and by how much the timeline of what Celeste did and didn't know would come to matter in ways I could not have anticipated. That autumn, watching my daughter accept a second-place ribbon with the gracious disappointment of someone already planning her comeback, the years that followed the trust finalization were, on the whole, the steadiest of Ren's young life. She turned 9, then 10, growing into a confident, curious, occasionally exasperating preteen who maintained her marine biology ambitions with a consistency that impressed even her science teachers, who had, by then, started recommending her for a summer program at the regional aquarium that would become, over the following 2 years, one of the genuine joys of her childhood. Daniel's visits continued, steady and welcome, his calls a fixture of our weekly rhythm, his presence at school events and birthdays a quiet, dependable constant that Ren came to take for granted in the specific, healthy way children take for granted the adults who never give them a reason to expect otherwise. Sam and I built our own steady rhythm alongside all of it, not without friction, because no real partnership exists entirely without friction, but with a foundation solid enough that the friction never threatened the structure itself. We talked occasionally about marriage in the unhurried way to people talk about a thing they're both fairly confident they'll eventually do. Without any particular urgency attached to the timeline, I kept documenting, because by then it was simply who I was. School records, medical updates, the steady accumulation of an ordinary, well-loved childhood, alongside the more formal tabs for trust and legal that I maintained out of habit and Mr. Okonkwo Lewis's careful instruction, rather than any active sense of impending need. I did not know, in those steady golden years, that I was building toward anything beyond the ordinary record-keeping of a life well lived. I did not know that within 2 years, Daniel's health scare from the coffee shop conversation would return in a far more serious form, or that his death, when it came, would set in motion the exact sequence of events he had quietly, carefully prepared for, years in advance. With a foresight that none of us in those good years ever wanted to need, I only knew, watching Ren turn 10 with a marine biology cake she designed herself and a guest list that included Sam and Yvonne's family and, on a video call from 3 states away because his schedule hadn't allowed him to fly in that particular year, Daniel singing happy birthday slightly off-key into his phone's camera. That whatever else this family had become, assembled by choice rather than simple biology, built out of showing up rather than blood alone, it had become, against every reasonable expectation, given how it started, something genuinely, durably good. I want that recorded too, in this account, the way I recorded everything else in the binder across those years. Not every chapter of this story is about conflict. Some of it, for a good long stretch, was simply about a happy, ordinary childhood, built by people who chose to show up, again and again, for no reason except that they wanted to. Daniel called me himself, the first time, instead of going through any intermediary, on a Tuesday evening in the spring after Ren's 11th birthday, and I knew within the first few seconds of his voice, a particular flatness to it, the careful, controlled register of someone delivering news they've already cried through privately and are now determined to deliver, without falling apart a second time, that whatever he was about to tell me was not going to be the kind of thing either of us could fix with patience and good planning. The scare a few years back, he said, without much preamble, the one I told you about in the coffee shop, it's not a scare anymore. It's back, and it's more aggressive this time, and I wanted you to hear it from me directly, before anyone else became involved in any way. I will not dwell, in this account, on the specific medical details, partly out of respect for what belonged to Daniel and not to me, and partly because the details themselves, however clinically familiar they were to a nurse of my experience, mattered less than the simple, devastating fact underneath them. It was fast-moving. It had been caught later than anyone wanted, and the prognosis, even with aggressive treatment, was measured in months rather than years. I sat down hard on my kitchen stool when he told me, the same stool I'd sat on countless times across the preceding decade, processing one piece of difficult news after another, and I remember the strange, doubled quality of my own grief in that moment. Grief for Daniel himself, who had become, over 4 years, someone I genuinely cared about, independent of his biological connection to Ren, and grief, arriving almost simultaneously, sharp and anticipatory, for what this would do to my daughter, who had only just in the past few years learned to trust that adults who said they would show up actually would. Does Ren know yet? I asked, because it was the most urgent practical question underneath everything else. No, he said. I wanted to tell you first. I wanted to ask you how you think I should do it, because you've had to have this exact kind of conversation with her before, about things she couldn't fully control or understand. And I trust your judgment about her more than I trust my own right now. We spent that call, and several after it, working through exactly how and when to tell her, eventually settling, with Dr. Whitfield's careful guidance, once we brought her back into the picture for this specific purpose, on a plan that gave Ren the truth in stages. First, that Daniel was sick. Then, as the treatment's limitations became clearer, the harder truth that the doctors didn't expect him to recover. I will not pretend that any of those conversations were easy, and I will not reconstruct them here in the kind of granular detail I gave to the conversation about Celeste, or the one about her own adoption, because some things belong, even in an account this thorough, only to the people who lived them. What I will say is that Ren, 11 years old, absorbed the news of her biological father's terminal diagnosis with a grief that broke something open in her that I had not seen since the early years of therapy with Dr. Whitfield, a grief for a relationship that had only existed, in its full form, for about 4 years, but that had clearly mattered to her exactly as much as any relationship of much longer standing might have. It's not fair, she told me, more than once, in those weeks, with the particular outraged clarity that children bring to injustices adults have long since learned to simply absorb. He just found me. We just started. It's not fair that he has to leave too. I did not try to talk her out of that feeling, because it was true, and because I had learned, across more than a decade of difficult conversations with her, that the most honest comfort I could offer was rarely reassurance that things would be fine, but rather the simple, steady acknowledgement that something was genuinely unfair, paired with the promise that she would not have to carry it alone. Daniel flew in twice during those final months, against his medical team's growing caution about travel, because he wanted, he told me, as much ordinary time with Ren as his body would allow before the disease made travel impossible altogether. I watched him, on those visits, work hard to keep things as normal as he could manage, asking her about the aquarium summer program, listening with full attention to her increasingly sophisticated theories about ocean ecosystems, never once, as far as I could observe, letting his own fear leak into the space he was trying to protect for her. He called me alone, near the end of one of those visits, and asked if we could talk privately while Ren was occupied with Sam in another room. I need to make sure everything's in order, he said. The trust, obviously, but I want to talk through some things with you directly, not just through Okonkwo Lewis's office, because I want you to understand exactly why I structured certain things the way I did. In case anyone ever questions it later, we sat at my kitchen table that evening, the same table where so much of this entire story had been written, quite literally, into existence over the preceding decade. And Daniel walked me through, with a clarity that I found almost unbearably composed, given the circumstances, exactly what he had built, and why. The trust stays exactly as structured, he said. You, as sole trustee, full discretion within the guidelines we set up. No changes needed there. Okonkwo Lewis built it to survive exactly this kind of contingency, which is the whole point of how careful we were about it. The affidavit stays on file with him, notarized, dated, exactly as it was when I signed it. I want you to have a copy too, for your own records. Not because I think you need convincing of anything, but because I want you to have, in your own hands, my own sworn account of what I came to understand about Celeste's abandonment, and about who actually raised our daughter.